The easiest method to break down pallets is to take a circular saw and simply cut all the boards off as you see here. To cut off all the boards safely, just make sure to avoid any nails. Now most pallet wood you see won't have a clean edge on it. The easiest way to put a straight line on a board is to use a joiner. Now since we don't have a joiner, we're going to use our joiner sled that we made. And if you want to check out how we built this, just check out this link up here. To rip a straight line onto the piece of pallet wood, we first added it to our joiner sled, butted it against the end stop block, and then clamped it down. We could then simply run the sled through a table saw, and the resulting board would have a perfectly flat edge on it. We then repeated the process of joining all the boards on our sled until we had finished all the pieces. There's no denying that this is a super tedious process, but making sure that the boards are perfectly straight will make sure that the pattern goes together perfectly later on. We then adjusted the fence on our table saw to the final width of the slats that we wanted on top of our table. We chose to do 2 inches, but you can do any size that you want. We then set up our miter saw to 45 degrees and began to cut miters on all of the slat pieces. And making sure that this 45 degree is spot on is critical to make sure the design goes together correctly. The easiest way to align your miter saw is to use a speed square to make sure that the 45 degrees is perfectly accurate and not necessarily rely on the gauge that's on your miter saw. We then grabbed a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and brought it over to our table saw to rip it down to the rough width. And if you want to download the free cut list, don't forget to head over to our website at spenceleydesignco.com. We started laying the lines out for our design by first measuring halfway between the width and the length of the table. We were then able to use a large straight edge and a speed square to draw a line all the way across the table. After our center line was drawn, we clamped down a speed square to that center line. The speed square serves as a reference edge for the pallet pieces to rest against, making sure the pattern maintains a perfectly straight line. We then took our first piece and applied an ample amount of wood glue with a silicone brush, making sure to cover the surface evenly. After the glue was applied, we butted the end up against the speed square. We clamped this first piece on to make sure that it was in the perfect position. If this first piece was misaligned from the marks we made earlier, the entire pattern would be off, so we took extra time to make sure that it was absolutely perfect. Once the clamps were set, we used our cordless nail gun to shoot 18 gauge brads into the pieces at an angle. These nails will hold the wood to the plywood base while the glue cures. Next time we make a table like this, we're going to skip the nails altogether and use small drops of super glue for an instant bond that doesn't leave visible nails on the final surface. We continued the same pattern of gluing and nailing the pieces down, making sure that every piece was in the perfect location. This is one step that precision cannot be overstressed on. One piece of wood that shifts even slightly out of alignment will mess the entire pattern up for the table. And while we work on attaching the rest of the pieces, we wanted to remind you to click that thumbs up button below and subscribe to our channel. We put out new projects almost every week, and you definitely won't want to miss what we have coming up. Attaching all these pieces to the plywood did take a lot of time, but it was well worth it when it was done. After waiting for the glue to cure overnight, we came back the next day to trim off the overhang. We set down a few pieces of polystyrene insulation to prevent the circular saw from hitting the ground. You definitely could spend the time cutting every piece to perfect size before you glue it to the plywood, but it seemed like a waste of time to us. Plus, since pallet wood is free, I'd rather just finish the project faster than perfectly utilize all the pallets we have. You'll notice on this step that the precision was honestly not a big deal. We really just wanted to break this down into a more manageable size before we cut it to final dimension. Once all the overhang was removed, we shifted our focus to building a router flattening sled. Now this sounds pretty complicated, but all it is a flat surface that allows the router to pass over the table to make it even. You'll understand more once you see it. To make that, we started by cutting down a couple of 2x4s, and then screwing them together with a couple deck screws. The dimensions are pretty much irrelevant, just make sure that it's big enough for your table and any other projects that you might want to use it for in the future. Once the base was made, we grabbed a piece of plywood and ripped it down into 3 pieces. One piece should be just about 1.5 inches larger than your router base, and the other 2 pieces should be about 2 inches tall. We then brought our pieces over to our workbench and applied glue to the edge of the smaller pieces, making sure not to have too much squeeze out, and then clamped and nailed them together. Oh, and bonus tip we picked up from the Modern Builds channel that we wanted to pass on: use an old sriracha bottle as your glue bottle. The small tip works perfectly for precision glue application. The next step is to mark where you need to cut out material from the sled for the router bit to fit. Now you could probably just use your router bit to do this, but you'd have to take a lot of passes, and honestly it's just a lot faster to use a jigsaw. Anyway, after we marked out the area to remove, we drilled holes large enough for the jigsaw blade to fit in, and then proceeded to cut out the center of the sled. To make sure everything slid well, we applied a bit of paste wax to the top of the sled. Now this isn't mandatory by any means, but it'll help the router continue to glide smoothly across the sled as we flatten everything. To finish off the sled, we attached a piece of scrap plywood to each end of the sled. This will ensure that the sled won't fall off the base that we made earlier. We just applied glue and then nailed them in place so we could start the messy task of flattening the table. We grabbed this 2.5-inch slab servicing bit from Amazon for like $8. We're going to throw a link down in the description below, but honestly, for $8, this thing's a beast. Okay. Miranda then put a couple small dabs of hot glue on the base of the flattening jig, and then we laid the tabletop down and stood on it until the glue had dried. Now this will be just enough to hold the table so it won't move while we route, but it'll be easy enough to remove when we're finished. We then started the long and messy task of flattening the table. Everything was going great as we run our router over the table until... Oh no way, you've got to be kidding me. We blew the breaker. Now after we'd gotten our breaker reset, I came back later to continue to flatten the slab. Now Miranda wasn't able to help out during this portion, so we didn't have the dust collection running. You'll notice as things progress, the air gets extremely dusty. A dust mask is 100% required when you're doing something like this. It just makes a ridiculous mess. All this could be avoided if we had a planer, but we haven't picked one up yet. Now I just wanted to give you guys an idea of the mess that this process makes. There were a couple inches worth of dust on the floor, and literally every surface in the shop was covered in dust. Again, you need a dust mask at the bare minimum. After completing the step, I actually immediately got on Amazon and bought an actual respirator. But let's be honest, the best part about making a ridiculous amount of sawdust is sucking it all up in the cyclone. Now there's just something oddly satisfying about it that never gets old. Now after using the router flattening jig, the table is overall flat, but there's still some small ridges left from the edge of the router bit. So we brought out our belt sander and went over the whole table to remove all of the ridges. We marked a line where the center of the pattern met the edge of the plywood on both sides, and then pried the tabletop off the sled base and put the table back down on the polystyrene insulation on the floor. Now we then made one additional mark equal distant from the center mark on each side of the table. We then added the distance from the circular saw blade to the edge of the circular saw base plate and set our clamp over that line. Now once the straight edge was all set up, we could run our circular saw down the edge of the table. The whole reason we're doing this extra step is to make sure that we have one edge of the table that is perfectly parallel with the herringbone design. And once one edge of the table was parallel, we ran the tabletop through the table saw to trim off the opposite side to make sure that that also was parallel. Now you can't just immediately trim this top down to final dimension in one pass, because the pattern wouldn't run down the center of the table. The interior of our tabletop has a final width of 18 inches, so we made marks 9 inches away from the center line all the way down the table. We then brought the tabletop back over to the table saw and adjusted the fence so it was slightly outside of our line, and we made multiple passes to slowly sneak up on the 9-inch marks we had made. Now the first pass was pretty close to the line, so we just barely adjusted the fence over to try to meet our 9-inch mark. We made one more pass, but still wasn't quite there, so we had to adjust the fence over again before making the final pass. When trying to make a precision cut on a large piece, we always like to attach a feather board to the table saw to keep constant pressure between the wood and the fence. The feather board paired with the tiny adjustment of the fence allowed us to perfectly cut to the 9-inch line. After the first side was perfect, we flipped the tabletop over and followed the same process of sneaking up on the 9-inch mark but on the opposite side of the table. While we trimmed down the other side of the table to final width, we wanted to take a second to remind you to follow us over on Instagram at Spenceley Design Co. Over there, you can find behind the scenes shots of all of our projects we're making and interact with us. If you ever have any questions, feel free to send us a message and we'll always get back to you. Once the table was down to final width, we were ready to cut it to final length. The final length of the interior of our table is 40 inches, so with the center line of the table, we know that we want it to be 20 inches away from the center line. We then brought our speed square over to our tabletop to make a perpendicular line across the table. We clamped our straight edge down and used a circular saw to cut the table to final length. We then cut the other side and the main tabletop was finished. After looking through our stash of pallet wood, we found 2 runners that would make a perfect border for the table. We then cut those runner pieces we found in our pallet wood stash down to rough length at the miter saw. Now, we always suggest that you cut these much longer than you think you need so you can sneak up on the 45-degree miter cut when framing the table. We then used the same joiner jig from before to rip a straight line on these pieces, and then set our table saw fence to the width of our border, in our case, 1 inch. We then ran all of our pallet runners through the table saw, and in total we ripped 4 pieces down to make sure that they were all the same thickness. We then set up our miter saw and locked it into the 45-degree mark. We made a cut on one of the pieces and then brought it over to the tabletop to measure the length for the other cut. This is our favorite method for making perfect miter cuts. Simply line up the cut side perfectly to the corner and then use a razor blade to mark the exact line that you need to make over on the miter saw. We like to make our first cut very rough, then slowly sneak up on the line until we cut it perfectly. Yeah, it's always a little bit more work, but it always ensures the miters are flawless. And when we bring that piece back to the tabletop, you can see just how perfectly it fits with this cutting method. We followed the same process for the remainder of the border pieces. First cutting one end, laying it out on the tabletop, marking the cut line with a razor blade, and then sneaking up on the line with the miter saw until all the border pieces were complete. We then flipped the tabletop over and used a silicone brush to spread glue on the first border piece while we clamped it down and nailed it in place. We grabbed an adjacent piece and applied plenty of glue before nailing it to the top. Again, here you can see how well our razor blade trick works to making perfect miter joints. There's absolutely no visible gap. We continued around the table making sure that all the pieces were perfectly flush with the tabletop and that all the miters were perfectly joined together. Now it's probably unnecessary, but we put a band clamp around the table overnight while the glue set up just to make sure that nothing shifted. After the glue cured, we came back the next day and used our cordless router with a 1/4 inch roundover bit to ease over the edges. Although we do have a larger router, we love how lightweight and easy to handle the palm router is. Now, since this doesn't have a ton of power, our best tip is to just take your time. Going too fast will only bog the motor down and you won't get a clean edge. Once all the edges were rounded over, it was time to sand everything. Miranda started by hand sanding the edges, while I used the random orbit sander to get the tabletop perfectly smooth. Now, since we're going to be finishing this using a thick polyurethane finish, sanding up to a super fine grit really isn't that necessary. We just worked our way up to 120 and called it a day. Now, the finish that we like to use on these tables is a water-based polyurethane. It's available at most home centers and comes in a variety of surface finishes including matte, satin, semi-gloss, and gloss. It's super simple to apply with a foam brush and dries in just a few hours. We had an old can of finish hanging around and somehow managed to have just enough to do our first coat. The next day we came back to sand down the surface to 220 grit to remove any of the small bumps. And before we put our next layer of poly on, we used the vacuum to remove all of the pesky surface dust. And when we were certain that all of the dust was removed, we put our final top coat on. To finish up the table, we flipped it over the next day to add a special message on the underside.
Did I spell that right? I spelled it wrong. No, it's 2 R's. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. You said MERY.
I said RR.
Oh.
Arr. So glad that's on microphone. We then put one final coat of finish over the bottom of the table to seal the message in. After the poly dried a few hours later, we were ready to attach the hairpin legs. Simply push them into the corner and use a pencil to mark out your holes. We then wrapped a piece of masking tape around the drill bit to prevent drilling through the table, and after the mandatory rapid-fire drill test, drilled pilot holes. The leg was then brought back and we drove screws into the pilot holes to hold the legs on tight. The remaining legs were put on the exact same way, where we marked the hole, pre-drilled, and then attached the leg using the screws. We'll throw a link to these hairpin legs we found on Amazon in the description below. They're super heavy duty and came with all the screws needed to mount them to the table. And after the final leg, the table was finished. We're so happy with how this table turned out, and we'd really love to hear what you guys have to say down in the comments below. We always take a look at those and we really appreciate any feedback.